What happens when a man who speaks in slow, philosophical rhythms, who believes life is less about answers and more about alignment, sits across from a woman whose questions are sharp, political, and designed to provoke? What happens when calm collides with confrontation, when Texas-born introspection meets New York blunt force honesty, all under the bright, unforgiving studio lights of The View? Before we go any further, if you love intense celebrity moments, behind-the-scenes tension, and cinematic breakdowns of TV confrontations, subscribe to Stage View right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us whose side you think you'd be on, because this moment divided the internet in ways no one expected. The applause begins before Matthew McConaughey even reaches his chair. It's polite at first, then warm, then enthusiastic. He walks out with that familiar half-smile, the one that suggests he's amused by the world, but not overwhelmed by it. He waves casually, taps the desk lightly as he sits, and for a split second, it feels like this is going to be easy. A friendly interview. A movie star promoting a book, a film, an idea. Safe territory. Joy Behar watches him closely. She doesn't clap as long as the others. Her eyes narrow just slightly, not in hostility, but in calculation. Joy has been doing this too long to be starstruck. She's seen charm up close. She's seen men like him disarm rooms with humor and warmth. And she knows that sometimes, beneath all that charm, there's a worldview that needs to be challenged. The introductions roll by quickly. Laughter. A joke about Matthew's accent. A playful reference to his laid-back persona. He chuckles, leans back in his chair, crosses his ankle over his knee. He looks comfortable. Maybe too comfortable. Joy tilts her head and smiles. "So, Matthew," she says, voice light but measured, "you talk a lot about values, about personal responsibility, about finding your own path. And people really respond to that." Matthew nods slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he says. "I think most people are just trying to figure out how to live a life that feels true." The audience murmurs approvingly. This is familiar ground for him. Philosophy, meaning, personal truth. Joy doesn't interrupt. She lets the silence stretch just long enough to signal that what comes next matters. But, she continues, when you talk about personal responsibility, some people hear something else. They hear a dismissal of systemic problems. Inequality, politics, power structures. Do you think focusing on the individual sometimes lets institutions off the hook? The air changes. It's subtle, but it's there. A shift in temperature. The audience stills. Matthew's smile softens, then fades into something more thoughtful. He leans forward now, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. He's listening, not just to the words, but to the intention behind them. "I don't think it's either-or," he says carefully. "I think we can hold institutions accountable while still encouraging individuals to take ownership of their lives." Joy raises an eyebrow. "But that sounds nice in theory," she says. "In reality, not everyone starts from the same place. Telling people to just take ownership can sound like blaming them for circumstances they didn't create." A ripple of applause breaks out. Not loud, but pointed. Matthew inhales slowly. You can almost see him choosing his words, like a man stepping through a minefield with deliberate calm. "I hear that," he says. "And I'm not blind to inequality. I've seen it. I've lived around it. But I also believe that the one thing no one can take from you is your agency. And if we don't emphasize that, we risk telling people they're powerless." Joy leans back, folds her arms. "Or," she counters, "we risk telling people that if they're struggling, it's their fault." That lands harder. The audience reacts audibly this time. Some applause, some murmurs, a few uncomfortable laughs. The co-hosts glance at each other. One of them shifts in her seat, sensing the escalation. Matthew's jaw tightens for just a moment. It's the first visible crack in the relaxed exterior. "That's not what I'm saying," he replies, a little firmer now. "I'm saying empowerment starts inside. Not in Washington. Not on TV. Inside." Joy's eyes lock onto his. "And I'm saying," she replies, "that for a lot of people, empowerment without policy is just a motivational poster." The studio goes quiet. This is no longer a casual interview. This is a philosophical standoff, broadcast live, with millions watching. Matthew McConaughey, the man who once preached, all right, now finds himself defending a worldview against one of daytime television's most relentless interrogators. He smiles again, but this time, it doesn't quite reach his eyes. "Joy," he says, "I think you and I want the same thing. A society where people can thrive. We're just approaching it from different angles." She nods, but doesn't soften. Maybe, she says. But angles matter when people's lives are on the line. The words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. A producer off-camera gestures subtly, signaling a transition, maybe even a commercial break. But the tension doesn't dissipate. If anything, it sharpens. Matthew shifts in his chair, rolling his shoulders back like a man bracing himself. Joy adjusts her glasses, ready to push further. Neither of them knows it yet, but this conversation is about to go somewhere no one in that studio planned for. And by the time it's over, social media will be on fire, audiences will be divided, and this moment will be replayed, dissected, and debated long after the cameras stop rolling. The red light above the camera flickers for just a moment, then steadies again. They're back. No commercial break yet. No relief. Whatever this is, it's happening live. Matthew feels it first, not fear, not anger, but awareness. The kind that settles into your spine when you realize the conversation has crossed an invisible line. He straightens slightly, not defensively, but deliberately. This is no longer about promoting a book or sharing anecdotes. This is about meaning, responsibility, power. And Joy Behar is not letting go. Joy leans forward now, palms resting flat on the table, her voice calm but edged. You've flirted with politics before, she says. You've spoken about leadership, about running for office. And people listen to you. A lot of people. Do you think it's responsible to speak in philosophical terms when the reality for many Americans is brutally concrete? Matthew exhales through his nose, a slow breath. I don't flirt with politics, he replies. I flirt with ideas. And I think ideas shape reality. Joy smiles faintly, but it's not amusement, it's challenge. Okay, she says. Then let's talk about a concrete idea. Healthcare, education, wages. These aren't abstract concepts. They're systems. And systems don't change just because someone believes harder. The audience reacts, applause louder this time. Someone in the back says, that's right. Matthew hears it. He hears all of it. And for a moment, he considers deflecting. A joke. A story. Something folksy and charming. It would work. It always does. But he doesn't do it. I grew up watching my parents struggle, he says instead, voice lower now. I've seen what happens when systems fail. But I've also seen what happens when people wait for systems to save them. Joy tilts her head. And what happens, she asks. They lose time, he answers. They lose belief. They lose momentum. Joy's eyes flash. Or, she fires back, they lose because the game was rigged from the start. A sharp intake of breath ripples through the audience. One of the co-hosts opens her mouth as if to jump in, then closes it again. This isn't her fight. Matthew nods slowly as if conceding a point, but only partially. Life isn't fair, he says. I don't think anyone at this table believes it is. But my concern is this. If we tell people they're victims first, we risk locking them into that identity. Joy's voice hardens just a shade. And my concern, she replies, is that if we tell people they're authors of their own fate, we ignore the chapters written before they ever picked up the pen. The studio is silent now. No applause. No laughter. Just listening. Matthew shifts, uncrosses his legs, plants his feet firmly on the floor. I'm not ignoring history, he says. I'm saying history doesn't have to be destiny. Joy leans back, crossing her arms again, her tone suddenly sharper. That sounds inspiring, she says. But it also sounds like something someone who's already made it would say. That hits. For a split second, the mask slips. Not anger, something closer to hurt. Matthew blinks, then smiles thinly. You think I don't know my privilege? He asks. Joy doesn't hesitate. I think you benefit from it, she says. And I think it colors how you see the world. A murmur rolls through the audience, louder, restless. This is dangerous territory. Accusatory. Personal. Matthew nods once sharply. Of course it does, he says. Just like your experiences color yours. The question is whether we're allowed to speak at all unless we've lived every version of hardship. Joy's lips press together. No, she says. The question is whether powerful voices understand the weight they carry. The tension thickens, almost visible. The co-hosts exchange glances again. One of them shifts closer to her microphone, testing the waters. Another stares straight ahead, hands folded tightly. Matthew's voice softens, but there's steel beneath it now. I take that weight seriously, he says. That's why I speak about responsibility. Because I don't want to rob anyone of their belief in themselves. Joy leans in again, eyes unwavering. And I don't want to rob anyone of the truth, she says. which is that belief alone doesn't pay rent. Applause erupts, loud, sustained, unmistakable. This time it's not polite. It's charged. Matthew waits for it to die down. When it does, he speaks slowly, carefully, like each word has to pass through a filter. Joy, he says, do you believe people have agency? She doesn't blink. Yes, she says. Within limits. And who defines those limits, he asks. Reality does, she replies. Economics does. Politics does. Matthew nods, then leans forward, his voice more intense now. Then that's where we differ, he says. Because I believe limits are often starting points. The audience reacts again, this time split. Some applause. Some groans. Someone shakes their head. Joy laughs softly, incredulous. That's a very Hollywood way of looking at things, she says. And that's a very cynical way of denying hope, Matthew shoots back, quicker than before. There it is. The shift from discussion to confrontation is unmistakable now. The pacing changes. The politeness phrase. Both of them are fully engaged, neither willing to concede ground. Joy's voice rises just slightly. Hope without action is fantasy, she says. And action without belief is hollow, Matthew counters. They lock eyes. The cameras linger, cutting between them, catching every micro-expression. The audience feels it. This is the moment they'll clip, share, argue about. A co-host finally steps in, voice tentative. Maybe there's a middle ground. Joy raises a hand, not rudely, but decisively. I want to finish this thought, she says. Matthew nods. Please, he says. Joy turns fully toward him now. You speak beautifully, she says. You really do. And I think that's why this matters. Because when someone with your platform talks about personal responsibility without equally emphasizing systemic accountability, people hear permission to ignore injustice. Matthew's reply comes instantly. And when we talk about systems without emphasizing personal responsibility, people hear permission to give up. The words collide in midair, heavy and unresolved. For a long moment, neither speaks. The studio clock ticks on. Producers shift nervously behind the cameras. This was not in the rundown. This was not rehearsed. Joy finally breaks the silence. So which is more dangerous? She asks. Ignoring systems or ignoring individuals? Matthew looks at her, really looks at her. Then he smiles, not charming this time, but sincere, almost sad. The most dangerous thing, he says, is pretending we can solve complex human problems with one narrative. The audience exhales collectively. Some applaud. Some don't. Joy nods slowly. On that, she says, we might actually agree. But the tension doesn't disappear. It lingers, unresolved, like a storm cloud hovering just beyond the studio walls. And as the segment edges toward its end, one thing becomes clear. This conversation is far from over. It's only getting deeper. And what comes next will push both of them, and the audience, into even more uncomfortable territory. The producers finally force the break. The screen cuts to commercial, but inside the studio, nothing relaxes. The applause sign doesn't light up. No one laughs it off. The tension hangs heavy, like the echo of a chord struck too hard. Matthew leans back in his chair, rolling his neck once, eyes lifting toward the ceiling. Joy removes her glasses and sets them carefully on the desk, as if precision can bring control back into the room. Neither of them speaks during the 30-second countdown. They don't need to. Everything that hasn't been said is louder than anything that has. A stagehand gestures. 5 seconds. Joy slips her glasses back on. Matthew leans forward again. The red light returns. Joy doesn't ease in. She goes straight for it. Matthew, she says, voice calm but sharpened by resolve. You've talked about possibly running for office. And moments like this matter because they show how someone handles pressure, disagreement, and responsibility. So let me ask you directly. Do you believe government has a moral obligation to intervene when people can't lift themselves up? The question lands like a gavel. Matthew doesn't answer immediately. He looks down at his hands, rubs his thumb against his knuckle, then looks back up. His voice, when it comes, is steady, but no longer casual. Yes, he says. I do. A small stir ripples through the audience. Joy's expression flickers, surprise maybe, or validation. But, Matthew continues, I also believe government intervention should be a trampoline, not a hammock. Joy exhales sharply through her nose. There it is, she says. That metaphor. Matthew doesn't flinch. Because it matters, he replies. A trampoline helps you rise. A hammock keeps you suspended. Joy's voice tightens. And who decides when someone's bouncing or just resting? Who gets to judge that? The audience leans in. This is the heart of it now. Judgment. Power. Matthew's eyes darken slightly, not with anger, but intensity. That's a fair question, he says. And it's one we should be afraid to answer too quickly. But fear of misuse doesn't mean we abandon the principle. Joy shakes her head slowly. I think what scares people, she says, is that principle often ends up punishing the most vulnerable. Matthew nods once. And what scares me, he says, is a culture that teaches people to wait instead of build. A murmur spreads. Some nods. Some crossed arms. Joy leans closer, her voice dropping, almost intimate now. Do you know how many people are working 2, 3 jobs and still can't build? She asks. They're not waiting. They're drowning. Matthew listens. He really listens. When he speaks, his tone shifts, less declarative, more reflective. I don't deny that, he says. And I don't think telling people to believe in themselves fixes it. But belief is still the starting line. Joy taps her fingers on the desk, once, twice. And policy, she says, is the track. The audience applauds. Matthew smiles faintly. Fair, he says. For a moment, it seems like the heat might cool. Like they've found a shared language. Then Joy pivots. You often talk about masculinity, she says. About men finding purpose, direction. Some critics say that rhetoric feeds into a kind of moral superiority, especially when it comes to who deserves help and who doesn't. What do you say to that? The shift is abrupt. Personal. The studio stiffens again. Matthew's posture changes. He sits straighter now, shoulders squared. I talk about responsibility, he says. Not superiority. But the line can be thin, Joy presses. Especially when men already feel entitled to power. A sharp intake of breath echoes from the audience. Matthew's voice firms. I don't believe in entitlement, he says. I believe in earning. Joy's eyes lock onto his. And what about people who never get the chance to earn? She asks. The question cuts deep. Matthew pauses longer this time. The silence stretches. Cameras zoom in. This is the pause people will analyze frame by frame. I think, he says slowly, that's exactly why we need to talk about both sides of this. Because ignoring opportunity is cruel. And ignoring effort is corrosive. Joy leans back, studying him. You really believe that balance exists, she says. I do, Matthew replies. I've seen it. Joy smiles faintly, but there's sadness in it now. I've seen the opposite, she says. For the first time, the confrontation feels less like a debate and more like two worldviews shaped by entirely different scars. One of the co-hosts finally interjects gently. Can I ask something? She says. Do you think this divide is why people are so angry right now? Joy turns to her, then back to Matthew. I think people are angry because they're not being heard, she says. Matthew nods. And I think they're angry because they've been told the story of their lives is already written. The audience reacts again, split straight down the middle. Joy's voice rises, not in volume, but in urgency. But sometimes the story is written, she says. By race, by class, by zip code. And sometimes, Matthew replies, equally urgent, the next chapter is still blank. They stare at each other. Neither blinks. The producers are frantic now. Time signals flash. Wrap it up. Move on. Joy senses it, but she's not done. If you ever run, she says, these aren't abstract ideas. These are decisions that affect real lives. Are you ready for that weight? Matthew answers without hesitation. I carry weight every day, he says. The question is whether we trust people to carry theirs too. The studio goes quiet. No applause this time. Just silence. Joy nods slowly. That, she says, is exactly where we disagree. The segment ends seconds later. Polite applause fills the space, but it's forced, brittle. The camera pulls back. Smiles return, thin and professional. But the damage, or the impact, is already done. Because what just happened wasn't an interview. It was a collision. And outside that studio, millions of viewers are already picking sides, clipping moments, typing furiously. By the time the episode ends, this exchange will be everywhere. Praised, condemned, misunderstood, weaponized. And the storm it sparks is about to get much, much bigger. The camera's cut. The applause fades. And just like that, the moment is over, at least inside the studio. But outside it detonates. Matthew stands, buttons his jacket, and thanks the hosts with practiced courtesy. His smile is polite now, restrained. Joy nods back, professional, composed, but there's a tightness around her eyes that wasn't there before. They don't speak again. Not privately. Not on camera. Not even with a passing joke to ease the weight of what just happened. As Matthew walks off the set, a producer whispers something into his ear. He nods once, slow, thoughtful. He already knows. You can feel it in the way his shoulders square. This wasn't just television. This was a line drawn in public. Joy remains seated a moment longer after the audience clears. She adjusts her notes, stacks them neatly, then exhales. A co-host leans toward her and murmurs, "That got intense." Joy doesn't smile. "It needed to," she replies. By the time the episode finishes airing on the East Coast, the internet is already ablaze. Clips flood social media. 30 seconds here, 40 seconds there. No context. No buildup. Just sparks ripped from the fire and tossed into the algorithm. Matthew McConaughey shut down on The View. Joy Behar exposes Hollywood privilege. McConaughey destroys victim mentality live on TV. Each headline tells a different story. Each clip crowns a different winner. On X, threads spiral into the thousands of comments deep. One side praises Matthew's calm, his refusal to be rattled. They call him thoughtful, grounded, brave for speaking about responsibility in a culture that, they say, rewards excuses. The other side rallies behind Joy. They call her fearless, necessary, one of the few voices willing to challenge comfortable philosophies with uncomfortable realities. She said what needed to be said. He's never missed a meal. Easy for him to talk about agency. Celebrities weigh in without naming names. A late-night host jokes about, all right, but what about healthcare? A political commentator calls the exchange the perfect snapshot of America's moral stalemate. Matthew doesn't tweet. He doesn't post an Instagram story. He doesn't issue a statement. But people close to him say the conversation stays with him. That he replays it, not to win it, not to rewrite it, but to understand it. He tells a friend later that night, she wasn't wrong. She just wasn't complete. And maybe, he admits quietly, neither was he. Joy, meanwhile, addresses it the next morning. Not directly, but deliberately. On the show, she speaks about power, platforms, and responsibility. About how charm can soften hard truths. About how philosophy becomes dangerous when it floats above lived experience. She never says Matthew's name. She doesn't have to. The audience reaction is just as divided as the internet. Emails pour in. Some thank her for holding the line. Others accuse her of ambushing a guest. Ratings spike. Producers notice. Tension, it turns out, is good television. But something else lingers beneath the noise. Because for many viewers, this wasn't about Matthew McConaughey or Joy Behar. It was about themselves. People see their own arguments reflected back at them. The fights they have at dinner tables. The ones they avoid at work. The ones that end friendships and split families. Responsibility versus systems. Hope versus realism. Belief versus policy. And that's why the moment endures. Not because someone won, but because no one did. The clip keeps circulating. Weeks later, it's still being shared. Still being argued over. Still making people uncomfortable. And maybe that's its real legacy. Not answers, but friction. The kind that forces reflection. Because when philosophy meets provocation, there is no clean ending. Only echoes. Now it's your turn. Whose argument resonated with you more? Matthew's belief in personal agency, or Joy's insistence on systemic accountability? Did one change your perspective, or harden it? Drop your opinion in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you want more explosive, cinematic breakdowns of celebrity confrontations, raw interviews, and moments that divide the world in real time, subscribe to Stage View right now. This is where the tension lives.